Lieutenant Carl Denton's gloved hand pressed against the cold aluminum skin of the B-17's fuselage, feeling the vibrations of 4 Wright Cyclone engines thundering through 28,000 feet of frozen air. Through the waist gun window, he could see white contrails streaming behind their bomber formation, like ribbons pointing straight toward them, and in the distance, dark specks that meant only one thing: German fighters closing in fast. His crew didn't know it yet, but in less than 3 minutes, he would do something no flight engineer had ever attempted. Something that would either save them all or send them spiraling into the burning wreckage of Berlin below. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of January 14th, 1944, had started like any other mission day at Bassingbourn Airfield in England. Carl Denton woke before dawn in a Quonset hut that smelled perpetually of damp wool, cigarette smoke, and the nervous sweat of men who knew that statistically they probably wouldn't survive their required 25 missions. He was on his 19th, 6 more to go if the odds held, though everyone knew the odds were terrible. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than they could replace them, and crews even faster than that. Carl was 23 years old, though he felt decades older. He had grown up in a small town in upstate New York, where his father ran a machine shop, and from the time he could walk, Carl had been taking apart engines and putting them back together. That mechanical intuition, that ability to understand how things worked not just in theory, but in practice, had made him a natural flight engineer. He knew the B-17 Flying Fortress better than most men knew their own cars. Every system, every quirk, every sound the aircraft made when something was about to go wrong. The briefing room was thick with tobacco smoke when Carl and his crew filed in at 0500 hours. The intelligence officer pulled back the curtain, covering the mission map, and a collective groan rippled through the assembled airmen. The red yarn stretched all the way to Berlin. Deep penetration missions into the heart of Nazi Germany were the worst. It meant hours of flying through flak fields, and it meant the Luftwaffe would throw everything they had at them. "Gentlemen," the intelligence officer began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Today's target is the Erkner Ball bearing factory on the eastern outskirts of Berlin. This is a vital component of their war production. Secondary targets include the railway marshalling yards. Expected fighter opposition is heavy. Flak will be intense over the target area. Weather forecast shows clear skies over the target, which is good for bombing, but means Jerry will see us coming from miles away." Carl sat beside his pilot, Captain Robert Hayes, a lanky kid from Texas, who somehow maintained an easy grin, even when discussing missions that would likely kill a quarter of them before lunch. Their bombardier, Lieutenant Vincent Palmer, was already doing calculations on his kneeboard. The navigator, Lieutenant James Kirkwood, studied the route with the intense focus of a chess player examining a board. Their radio operator, Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, sat quietly as he always did before missions, his fingers moving as if typing invisible messages. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Frank Morrison, cracked his knuckles repeatedly, a nervous habit. The tail gunner, Sergeant Robert Walsh, stared at nothing in particular, his face expressionless. The waist gunners, Sergeants Dennis Cooper and Harold Jenkins, whispered to each other, probably about the new replacement crews who would be flying their first mission today. After the briefing came breakfast, though few men could eat much: powdered eggs, toast, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with motor oil. Carl forced down what he could. You needed energy for these missions. 8, sometimes 10 hours in an unpressurized, unheated aircraft, where temperatures could drop to 50 below zero. Where you wore so many layers of clothing you could barely move. Where the oxygen mask froze to your face and you had to remember to test your oxygen supply every few minutes, because hypoxia could kill you before you realized anything was wrong. The ground crews had the bombers ready by 0630. Carl did his pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness that had kept him alive this long. He checked every fuel line, every hydraulic connection, every control cable. He inspected the oxygen system, the electrical systems, the props, the landing gear. The B-17 they were flying today was called Memphis Belle, though not the famous one. Every group seemed to have a bomber with that name. This one had completed 17 missions, which made it practically ancient in bomber years. They took off in the gray dawn, forming up over England in a complex aerial ballet that had been practiced until it became second nature. Their squadron consisted of 12 aircraft, part of a larger formation of nearly 700 bombers that would hit Berlin that day. The formation was everything. Stay tight, stay together, and the combined defensive fire of dozens of 50 caliber machine guns made attacking you a nightmare for enemy fighters. Straggle or fall behind, and you were dead. The English Channel passed below them, gray and cold and choppy. Then the coast of occupied Europe, the Netherlands first, then Germany itself. Carl stood in the flight deck behind Hayes and the co-pilot, Lieutenant George Anderson, monitoring the engines, watching the gauges, listening to the sound of the aircraft. Everything sounded right. The Cyclone engines were running smooth and steady, the props synchronized, the fuel flow normal. They climbed to bombing altitude, 28,000 feet, where the air was so thin that without oxygen, you would pass out in seconds. The formation tightened up as they crossed into German airspace. The first flak started over the border, black puffs of smoke appearing around them as German anti-aircraft batteries tried to find their range. The explosions made the bombers shudder and jump. Shrapnel pinged off the aluminum skin. Everyone tensed, waiting for the hit that would turn their aircraft into a falling torch, but the flak passed and they flew on. The fighter attacks began 20 minutes from Berlin. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, coming in from all angles, their cannons flashing. The 50s in the ball turret, the tail, the waist, the top turret all opened up, filling the air with tracers. The noise was incredible, even through the leather flying helmet and the engine roar. The smell of cordite mixed with hydraulic fluid and the ever-present odor of high-octane aviation fuel. Carl moved through the aircraft, checking systems, helping the waist gunners clear jammed guns, making sure nothing had been shot away. A Focke-Wulf made a head-on pass, and Carl saw the winking lights of its cannons firing. Holes appeared in the nose section. He heard Palmer curse over the intercom. "I'm okay, just ventilation," the bombardier called out, which was bomber crew humor for, "We just got shot full of holes, but nobody died. They lost a bomber from the squadron over Magdeburg." Carl watched it happen. Watched the fort take a direct flak hit in the number 3 engine. Watched the engine explode and tear away from the wing. Watched the wing fold upward and the bomber roll onto its back and begin the long spiral down. He counted parachutes. 5, maybe 6. Not enough, never enough. Berlin appeared on the horizon, a sprawl of gray and brown under a clear winter sky. The flak over the city was the worst Carl had ever seen. The Germans had more anti-aircraft guns defending Berlin than anywhere else in Europe, and they were all firing. The sky turned black with explosions. The bomber shuddered continuously as shrapnel tore through it. The noise was like being inside a drum while someone beat it with hammers. "Bomb bay doors open," Hayes called over the intercom, his Texas drawl somehow still calm. The doors rumbled open beneath them, increasing drag, making the bomber slower and harder to control. They were committed now, had to fly straight and level through the flak no matter what, because Palmer needed a steady platform for the bomb run. "Bombardier to pilot, I've got the aircraft," Palmer called, which meant he was now controlling the bomber through his Norden bomb sight, making tiny corrections to line up on the target. Longest 60 seconds of any mission, that bomb run. Can't turn, can't climb, can't dive. Just fly straight while the enemy shoots at you. The aircraft rocked as a flak burst exploded close enough to rattle Carl's teeth. More holes appeared in the fuselage. A piece of shrapnel the size of a baseball punched through 3 feet from Carl's head and embedded itself in the opposite wall, glowing red hot. He could feel the heat from it. "Bombs away!" Palmer's voice, sharp with relief. The bomber lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive left the bomb bay. The doors rumbled shut. Hayes took control back and threw the bomber into a hard banking turn, heading away from the target, away from the flak, away from Berlin. But the fighters weren't done. A pair of 109s came up from below, where the ball turret had limited traverse. Their cannons chewed into the bomber's belly. Morrison, the ball turret gunner, was screaming something incoherent over the intercom. Fluid sprayed into the waist section. Carl scrambled back to see hydraulic lines severed, sparking wires, and worse, a fuel line that was leaking high-octane gasoline into the aircraft. He grabbed a fire extinguisher with one hand and with the other started shutting off valves, isolating the damaged section, stopping the leak. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, no wasted motion. The leak stopped, but not before several gallons had sprayed into the aircraft. The smell was overwhelming, dangerous. One spark, and they would explode. Engineer to pilot, we've got battle damage in the waist. Hydraulic system is compromised. I've isolated it. We should have enough hydraulics for landing. Had a fuel leak, but it's under control now. Roger that, Carl. Nice work. The formation was reforming, pulling back together after the chaos of the bomb run. Carl climbed back to the flight deck to monitor the engines and check their fuel status. They had enough to make it home, barely. The number 2 engine was running a little rough, probably took some shrapnel, but it was still producing power. That's when Carl noticed the contrails. Every bomber in the formation was leaving thick white condensation trails behind them, and those trails were pointing like arrows back at their formation. The moisture in the engine exhaust was freezing in the cold air, creating visible markers that could be seen for miles. It was a common phenomenon at high altitude, but today it was going to get them killed, because in the distance, Carl could see them coming. A large formation of German fighters, at least 30 of them, vectoring in on their position. The contrails had given them away. The fighters would follow those white ribbons straight to the bombers, and this time, the Luftwaffe had enough aircraft to overwhelm their defensive fire. Pilot, this is Engineer. We've got a large fighter formation approaching from 10 o'clock high. At least 30 aircraft. I see them. Hayes' voice was tight now, the easy drawl gone. Gunners, stay alert. Looks like we're going to be busy. Carl stared at the contrails streaming behind their formation, his mind racing. The contrails were the problem. The contrails were what was marking them for the fighters. If they could eliminate the contrails, maybe the fighters would lose them in the confusion. But how do you eliminate contrails? They were caused by engine exhaust. You couldn't turn off the engines. Unless... An idea formed in Carl's mind, so crazy that his first instinct was to dismiss it. But the fighters were getting closer, and he could see the squadron didn't have time to run. Most of them were low on ammunition after the running battles getting to and from the target. Some had damaged engines, wounded crew, structural damage. They couldn't take another sustained attack. The idea wouldn't go away. It was insane, dangerous, against every regulation in the book. It might work, or it might blow them all out of the sky. But doing nothing meant the fighters would pick them apart, and Carl had not survived 19 missions by doing nothing when something needed to be done. He keyed his throat microphone. Pilot, this is Engineer. I need to discuss something with you, in person. Hayes glanced back at him, surprised. Normally everything was discussed over the intercom. Make it quick, Carl. Carl leaned in close so his words wouldn't be picked up by the microphone. He explained his idea, watching Hayes' face go from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been respect or might have been fear. That is the craziest damn thing I've ever heard, Hayes said finally. It might blow us up. It might, Carl agreed. But those fighters are definitely going to shoot us down if we don't do something. Our contrails are pointing right at us. I'm thinking if we can create a mist of fuel around the formation, it might obscure the contrails, make it harder for them to track us visually. At worst, it confuses them for a few minutes. At best, they lose us entirely. Hayes was silent for a long moment, thinking. Anderson, the co-pilot, had been listening. You want to deliberately spray aviation fuel into the air at 28,000 feet with German fighters about to attack us? Essentially, yes. We'll need approval from the squadron lead, Hayes said. He reached for the radio, switching to the command frequency. Blue Leader, this is Blue 7. My engineer has a suggestion regarding our contrail problem. Request permission to implement an emergency procedure. There was a pause, then the squadron commander's voice crackled over the radio. Tense. Blue 7, we don't have time for experiments. Those bandits will be on us in minutes. Sir, with respect, my engineer thinks he can obscure our contrails, make it harder for Jerry to track us. Another pause, longer this time. The squadron commander knew as well as anyone that they were in trouble. How? Hayes looked at Carl, who took the microphone. Blue Leader, this is Blue 7's engineer. I propose creating a controlled fuel leak that will spray aviation fuel into our slipstream. The fuel mist should mix with our contrails and create a cloud effect that will make us harder to track visually. The fuel will dissipate quickly in the cold air, but it should give us cover. That's insane. You'll blow yourself up. Maybe, sir, but those fighters are definitely going to shoot us down if they get a clean approach. a longer silence. Carl could almost hear the wheels turning in the squadron commander's head, weighing the risks. Finally, "If you want to try it, Blue 7, you have my permission, but you're on your own. I'm not ordering anyone else to spray fuel into the air." "Understood, sir." Carl was already moving. He went back to the waste section where he had just repaired the fuel leak. The damaged fuel line was still there, isolated by valves he had closed. If he opened those valves and punctured the line in the right place, he could create a spray of fuel that would be sucked out by the slipstream through the waste gun windows. Cooper and Jenkins, the waste gunners, stared at him like he had lost his mind when he explained what he was about to do. "You're going to spray fuel into the aircraft?" Cooper's voice was high with disbelief. "Out of the aircraft," Carl corrected. "The slipstream will pull it out through the gun windows. In theory." "In theory," Jenkins repeated. "What if we blow up?" "Then we die instantly and won't feel a thing," Carl said, which was not at all comforting, but was also true. "Listen, we're dead anyway if those fighters get a clean run at us. This might work." He didn't wait for their approval. Time was running out. He could see through the waste windows that the German fighters were much closer now, spreading out to attack from multiple angles. 2 minutes, maybe 3 before they opened fire. Carl found his tools and went to work on the fuel line. His hands were steady despite the cold, despite the fear, despite the absolute insanity of what he was about to do. He had to make a cut in the line that would create a spray, not a stream. Too much fuel, and they would indeed blow up. Too little, and the effect would be negligible. He made the cut with a hacksaw, careful, precise. Fuel immediately began leaking, just a trickle because the valves were still mostly closed. He adjusted the cut, widening it slightly. Then he reached for the isolation valves. "Pilot, this is Engineer. I'm about to open the fuel valves. Tell everyone no smoking, no guns unless absolutely necessary. 1 spark could ignite the fuel mist." "Roger. All crew, this is Pilot. Do not, I repeat, do not fire your weapons or create any sparks until Engineer gives the all clear. This is not a drill." Carl positioned himself next to the valves. He could see through the window that the fighters were less than a mile away now, preparing for their attack run. It was now or never. He opened the valves. Fuel sprayed from the cut line under pressure, a fine mist that the wind from the open gun windows immediately caught and sucked outside. The smell of high-octane gasoline filled the waste section, making Carl's eyes water. He had to fight down the instinct to close the valves immediately, to stop this dangerous flow of highly flammable liquid. But he could already see the effect. The fuel mist was mixing with the exhaust from the engines, creating a thick white fog that surrounded the bomber. The clean contrails that had been streaming behind them were now lost in a billowing cloud of vapor. He couldn't see the other bombers in the formation anymore. Everything was white. "Blue 7, what the hell are you doing?" The squadron commander's voice was sharp with alarm. "You're completely obscured. We can't see you." "That's the idea, sir," Hayes responded. "If we can't see ourselves, Jerry can't see us either." Carl moved to the other side of the aircraft and looked out the opposite gun window. The German fighters were visible, but they seemed confused. Their tight attack formation had loosened. They were searching, clearly looking for the bombers they knew had to be there, but couldn't find in the sudden fog that had appeared. "It's working," Carl breathed. "Pilot, it's actually working. The fighters can't see us." "Engineer, can you get the other bombers to do the same thing?" Hayes asked. "If the whole formation creates this fog, we might actually get away clean." Carl grabbed the intercom. "Squadron, this is Blue 7 Engineer. If you've got damaged fuel lines from the flak, open them up. Let the fuel spray out the waste windows. If you don't have damaged lines, you can deliberately cut into a fuel line in the waste section. Make sure you isolate the tanks first so you don't drain everything. The fuel mist will mask your contrails." There was a moment of shocked silence on the channel, then other voices began responding. Some thought it was crazy. Some were willing to try. Carl watched as other bombers in the formation began trailing the same white mist, creating a fog bank at 28,000 feet where none should exist. The German fighters were completely confused now. Carl could see them through breaks in the mist, searching, firing random bursts in frustration, but they couldn't find targets. The formation of bombers had simply vanished into a self-created cloud. Some of the fighters flew right past the formation, overshooting entirely because they couldn't see where the bombers actually were. The Luftwaffe circled for several minutes, trying to find their targets, but the fuel mist was constantly replenishing itself, creating a shifting, moving fog that hid the bombers effectively. Finally, frustrated and probably low on fuel themselves, the German fighters broke off and headed back toward Berlin. "All aircraft, this is Blue Leader. Secure your fuel leaks." "Looks like Jerry's given up. Good work, Blue 7. Carl closed the valves, stopping the spray. The mist began to dissipate almost immediately in the cold air and the wind. Within a minute, it was gone, and the formation was visible again, still intact, still flying. They had survived. The relief was overwhelming. Carl sat down heavily on the floor of the aircraft, his legs suddenly weak. Cooper and Jenkins were laughing, the slightly hysterical laughter of men who have just escaped death and can't quite believe it. "You crazy son of a gun," Cooper said, slapping Carl on the shoulder. "You actually did it. You saved us." The rest of the flight back to England was almost peaceful compared to what had come before. They encountered no more fighters. The flak over the coast was light and inaccurate. They crossed the channel, and England appeared below them, green and safe and home. Landing was tricky with the damaged hydraulics, but haze brought the bomber down smoothly, and they taxied to their hard stand, where the ground crew was waiting. When the engines finally shut down and the props stopped turning, the sudden silence was almost shocking. They climbed out of the bomber on legs that felt like rubber. The ground crew chief walked around the aircraft, counting holes. He stopped counting at 50. "You boys got chewed up pretty good," he said, shaking his head. "But you made it back. That's what counts." The debriefing was intense. The intelligence officers wanted to know everything about the fuel mist tactic. How much fuel had been used? How long did the mist last? How effective was it? Could it be replicated deliberately? Other crews who had tried it confirmed that it had hidden them from the fighters. The consensus was that Carl's crazy idea had saved at least 6 bombers, and probably more. The squadron commander pulled Carl aside after the debriefing. "That was some quick thinking up there, Lieutenant. Unorthodox as hell, dangerous as hell, but it worked. I'm putting you in for a commendation." "Just doing my job, sir," Carl said, which was what you were supposed to say, even though what he had done was far beyond any job description. Word of the fuel leak trick spread fast through the bomber groups. Within days, crews were discussing it, modifying it, improving on it. Someone figured out that you could install a special valve that would allow controlled fuel spraying without having to cut into lines. Someone else calculated the optimal fuel flow rate that would create the best mist without wasting too much fuel. It became an unofficial tactic, not in any manual, not officially approved, but used by crews who found themselves in desperate situations. Carl Denton completed his remaining 6 missions without incident, which was its own kind of miracle. He survived the war, went home to New York, and took over his father's machine shop. He expanded it, built it into a successful business. He married, had children, lived a normal life that seemed almost impossible given what he had been through. He rarely talked about the war, which was common for his generation. The memories were too raw, too painful. He had lost too many friends. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, his children would ask him what he had done in the war. And he would tell them about the day he sprayed fuel into the sky over Berlin and hid an entire bomber squadron in a cloud of gasoline mist. His children would listen, eyes wide, trying to imagine their father as a young man doing something so insanely dangerous. They would ask if he was scared, and he would tell them the truth. Yes, he had been terrified. But fear didn't matter when people were depending on you. Fear didn't matter when you had a job to do. The B-17, Memphis Belle, that Carl had flown on that mission, completed 3 more missions before it was shot down over Frankfurt. The entire crew was lost. Carl attended their memorial service and stood in the cold English rain and thought about how random survival was in war. Why had he lived when so many others had died? There was no answer to that question, no logic to it. Just luck, good or bad. In the decades after the war, aviation historians would occasionally write about the fuel mist tactic, though it was never officially documented in any Air Force records. It remained one of those unofficial innovations that combat forces develop on their own, practical solutions to immediate problems that don't make it into the official manuals because they're too irregular, too dangerous, too hard to control. But the crews who used it knew. They knew that on that day over Berlin, a young flight engineer from upstate New York had come up with a crazy idea that had saved lives. They knew that sometimes the difference between survival and death was one person willing to try something that had never been done before, willing to take a risk that might kill everyone, but might also save everyone. Carl Denton died in 1998 at the age of 77. He was buried with full military honors, and his obituary mentioned his Distinguished Flying Cross and his service with the 8th Air Force. It mentioned his successful business career and his family and his contributions to his community. What it didn't mention, because no one outside his family really knew, was that on a clear winter day over Berlin, he had deliberately created a fuel leak at 28,000 feet and hidden an entire bomber squadron in a mist of vaporized gasoline, and in doing so had probably saved 60 or 70 lives. That story lived on only in the memories of his children and grandchildren, passed down like a family legend, the day Grandpa sprayed fuel into the sky and made bombers disappear. The B-17 Flying Fortress was retired from service after the war, replaced by newer, more advanced bombers. But those who flew them never forgot what it was like to climb into those aluminum cylinders and fly into hell day after day, knowing that the odds were against you. They never forgot the improvisation, the courage, the desperate measures taken to survive. And somewhere in the archives of the 8th Air Force, buried in mission reports and debriefing notes, there's a mention of a fuel leak over Berlin on January 14, 1944, that created an unusual vapor effect. It's just a footnote, barely noticed. But to those who were there, who saw it happen, who lived because of it, it was everything. The vapor trails that had marked their path that day had been erased by something more powerful. A cloud of fuel mist that hid them when they needed it most. It was a trick born of desperation and executed with precision, and it worked because one engineer understood his aircraft well enough to know what was possible, even if it had never been done before. That's what survival often comes down to, in war and in life. Not following the rules, but knowing when to break them. Not doing what's safe, but doing what's necessary. Not accepting that the situation is hopeless, but finding a way, any way, to change the outcome. Lieutenant Carl Denton found that way over the skies of Berlin, and in doing so, became part of the countless untold stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times. His name isn't in the history books. There are no statues or monuments, but for one day, in one moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. And 60-some men flew home to England that day who might not have otherwise. And some of them lived long enough to tell their children and grandchildren about the war, about the missions, about the day when everything seemed lost until one engineer decided to do something no one had ever tried before. That's the real victory, not the tactical success or the medals or the recognition. The real victory is in the lives saved, the families that remained whole, the futures that were able to unfold because someone refused to accept the inevitable. The contrails that marked their path had seemed like a death sentence, visible for miles, drawing the enemy straight to them. But Carl Denton had turned that vulnerability into an advantage, had used fuel itself to create a different kind of trail, one that concealed instead of revealed. It was brilliant in its simplicity, terrifying in its risk, and effective beyond what anyone had imagined. Years later, when aviation technology had advanced far beyond what anyone in 1944 could have imagined, when stealth technology and radar jamming and electronic countermeasures made the crude fuel mist tactics seem almost quaint, those who studied the history of aerial warfare would occasionally come across the story and marvel at it. In an age of high technology, there was something almost poetic about using the simplest possible method, just fuel and air and wind, to achieve invisibility. But to Carl Denton, sitting on the floor of that bomber over Berlin with fuel-soaked clothing and trembling hands, it hadn't seemed poetic at all. It had seemed terrifying and desperate and necessary. He had seen the fighters coming and known that his crew, his squadron, his friends were about to die unless something changed. So, he changed it, the only way he knew how. That's what heroism really looks like. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic music and slow motion and speeches. Real heroism is cold hands working on fuel lines while death approaches, is making a decision in seconds that will determine whether dozens of people live or die, is accepting responsibility for an outcome you can't fully control. The sky over Berlin that day had been full of such moments, full of gunners firing until their weapons jammed, pilots holding formation while flak tore into their aircraft, bombardiers completing their runs despite the chaos. Every man on every bomber was doing something that required courage, that required them to push past fear and do their duty. But what Carl Denton did was different because it was improvisation, because it was creation in the midst of destruction, because it turned a weapon, fuel that could burn and explode, into a shield that protected instead of harmed. It was the kind of thinking that wins wars, not by being stronger or having more resources, but by being clever enough to use what you have in ways the enemy doesn't expect. The German fighters that day had expected to find bombers where the contrails pointed. They had followed those white ribbons across the sky, confident that they would lead to targets. When the targets disappeared into an inexplicable fog, they were left confused, frustrated, unable to press their attack. By the time they might have figured out what was happening, the moment had passed and the bombers were gone. It was a small victory in a war full of enormous battles, but to the men who lived because of it, it was everything. They went home eventually. Most of them survived the war. They became fathers and businessmen and teachers and farmers. They lived the lives that Carl Denton's quick thinking had saved, and sometimes, in the years that followed, they would meet at reunions or by chance, and someone would say, "Remember that day over Berlin when Denton sprayed fuel everywhere?" And they would all laugh, the kind of laughter that comes from shared danger, survived, shared terror overcome. They would tell the story to their families, though the families could never quite grasp how desperate that moment had been, how close to death they had come. The story would become smoother with retelling, more dramatic, less terrifying, but the core of it remained true. One man had an impossible idea, tried it against all common sense, and saved them all. That's the story that deserves to be remembered. The story of innovation and courage and refusing to accept defeat even when defeat seems certain. It's a story about understanding your tools so well that you can use them in ways no one else has thought of. It's a story about taking responsibility when no one else can, about making decisions in impossible circumstances, about doing whatever it takes to bring your people home safe. Lieutenant Carl Denton's fuel leak over Berlin wasn't in the official tactics manuals, wasn't taught at flight school, wasn't approved by headquarters, but it worked. And that's what mattered. In the brutal mathematics of war, the only equation that counts is survival, and on that day, Carl Denton found a way to make the equation balance in favor of his squadron. The white mist of vaporized fuel that surrounded those bombers lasted only minutes before the cold air dispersed it. But in those few minutes, it was enough. It broke the attack, confused the enemy, gave the bombers time to escape. Sometimes that's all you need, just enough time for circumstances to change, for luck to shift, for survival to become possible again. And in the end, that's what the fuel leak did. It bought time, created opportunity, turned vulnerability into protection. It was a trick that couldn't be used too often, couldn't become standard procedure, but for the one moment on that one day, it was exactly what was needed. The story of how one engineer's crazy idea saved an entire bomber squadron over Berlin is not widely known, not celebrated in documentaries or taught in history classes, but it should be, because it represents something fundamental about human ingenuity and courage under pressure. It shows what's possible when someone refuses to accept the obvious outcome and instead creates a new possibility through sheer determination and creative thinking. Carl Denton lived a long life after the war, and he accomplished much. But if you asked him, as his grandchildren sometimes did, what he was most proud of, he would think for a moment and then talk about that day over Berlin. Not because he wanted glory or recognition, but because he knew that on that day, he had made a difference. He had saved lives. He had done something that mattered. And in the final accounting, when a life is measured, what more can be asked than that?